March 9, 1945, Mariana Islands, Pacific Ocean. As evening falls over American air bases on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the last light catches crews preparing 325 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers on runways carved from captured Japanese territory. Major General Curtis Lame, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, has ordered a sweeping change in Pacific bombing tactics. Bomb bays are packed well beyond usual loads with cluster munitions, each B-29 carrying 1,520 M69 incendiary bomblets filled with napalm that burns at about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The objective is deliberate and contentious. Tokyo's densely populated Shitamachi district, home to roughly 750,000 people living in wooden houses squeezed into 12 square miles. At 17:35, the first Silver B-29 departs Guam's North Field. As darkness deepens, the roar of R-3350 engines rises, and one bomber after another climbs into the night, flying individually rather than in tight formations and stripped of most defensive guns to double their incendiary load. Pathfinder planes lead, marking the target with a burning X visible for miles, followed by the main force releasing their ordnance from only 5,000 to 7,000 feet, far below their design bombing altitude. What happens next will showcase the devastating scale of American incendiary tactics and explain why Japanese air defenses, despite fierce resistance, could not stop what became the single most consequential air raid in history. The B-29 Super arrived in the Pacific as the most advanced Allied bomber of World War II. Its development required more than 1.44 million engineering hours and cost about $3 billion, an outlay larger than the Manhattan Project's $1.9 billion. This four-engine-heavy bomber featured pressurized crew compartments, remotely operated, gun turrets, and the most powerful piston engines fitted to any aircraft of the era. Production was spread across the country: Boeing in Seattle, Renton and Wichita, the Glenn L. Martin Company in Omaha, and Bell Aircraft in Marietta, Georgia. Each B-29 measured 99 feet long with a 141-foot wingspan and was powered by four Wright R-3350 duplex cycle engines producing roughly 2,200 horsepower apiece. The plane could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs over a combat radius near 1,600 miles, cruise at altitudes up to 31,850 feet, and reach a top speed of 357 mph. By March 1945, roughly 2,000 B-29s had been delivered to combat units, with production surging toward a wartime total of 3,970 aircraft, a striking display of American industrial might. Boeing's Wichita plant alone was turning out about 4.2 Superfortresses per working day. The 20th Air Force, under General Henry H. Hop Arnold's direct authority, had first used these strategic bombers from Chinese bases beginning in June 1944, and then from the newly captured Mariana Islands starting November 17, 1944. From the Marianas, the 21st Bomber Command ran 3 bombardment wings, the 73rd and 313th based on Saipan, and the 314th on Guam. Together, these units could field more than 300 B-29s for a single sortie, each aircraft maintained by specialized ground crews working around the clock. Japan's air defenses presented a stark contrast. By early 1945, the Imperial Army and Navy operated separate, poorly coordinated command systems with little inter-service communication. Their principal night fighter, the Nakajima J-1N Gecko Moonlight, was a hurried conversion from a reconnaissance plane, fitted with twin 20mm Type 99 cannons angled upward at 30 degrees and another pair firing downward. The Gecko could in theory strike bombers from unexpected directions, but only 479 had been produced during the war, and many were already lost. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu Dragon Killer offered another night fighting option with a 37mm nose cannon and oblique-firing 20mm guns. Yet only 1,171 of these had been built since 1941, lacking radar for night interceptions. These fighters depended on searchlights and visual sightings, nearly impossible against fast bombers crossing at night. Ground defenses were similarly inadequate. Tokyo had fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns protecting the whole metropolitan area. The Type 88 75mm gun provided the primary high-altitude defense, while the Type 92 20mm cannon handled closer range. But had an effective ceiling of only about 11,500 feet. Critically, Japan lacked fire control radar for its anti-aircraft batteries, relying instead on optical rangefinders and acoustic sound locators that failed in poor weather or darkness. The balance of forces was unfavorable. While the Americans could launch hundreds of B-29s from the Marianas, Japanese forces likely had around 200 operational night fighters across the home islands. By March 1945, fuel shortages curtailed training flights, leaving new pilots with little night flying experience. And aviation gasoline was so scarce that many planes were kept grounded to conserve fuel for defensive needs. Against an anticipated invasion, Major General Curtis Lamy took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945 and inherited a strategic bombing campaign that had not yet produced decisive results. High-altitude precision raids from 30,000 feet had proved ineffective because of the jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that scattered bombs miles off target. Straining engines to climb too high altitude with heavy loads led to frequent mechanical failures as magnesium alloy components overheated. Cloud cover obscured targets roughly 70% of the time, forcing crews to rely on primitive radar. After assessing these operational obstacles, Lamy ordered a provocative change that reshaped the air campaign against Japan. The new approach was bold but practical. Lamy directed that nearly all defensive guns be removed except for tail armament, allowing each B-29 to carry about 7 tons of incendiaries instead of roughly 3-5 tons of high explosives. Flying between 5,000 and 9,000 feet would avoid the jet stream, reduce engine stress, and improve bombing accuracy. Night operations would lower exposure to Japanese fighters that lacked radar and experienced night pilots. Individual aircraft would navigate using LORAN radio signals and attack in a continuous stream over several hours, rather than in compact formations. Weather forecasts predicted ideal conditions for the night of March 9th to 10th. Clear skies with strong surface winds that would help spread fires through the target area. Target selection underscored the operation's strategic intent. Planners focused on neighborhoods where cottage industries manufactured aircraft parts, electrical gear, and precision instruments inside small workshops interwoven with residential blocks. Intelligence officers used maps from the Office of Strategic Services and pre-war Japanese urban plans to rank Tokyo wards by infrastructure density. The chosen zone in northeastern Tokyo encompassed Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukugawa wards, working districts with extreme population density where extended families lived in wooden houses separated by narrow alleys. The M69 incendiary bomblet represented a sophisticated weapon designed specifically for this kind of attack. This hexagonal steel tube measured about 3 inches across, 20 inches long, and weighed roughly 6 pounds. Unlike earlier thermite or magnesium, designs that burned hotter but could be snuffed out, the M69 relied on napalm, a jellied gasoline developed by Standard Oil. Scientists working with researchers at Harvard. They were packed into E-46 cluster containers, each holding 38 bomblets that separated at around 2,000 feet. Every M69 trailed a cotton streamer to orient its fuse downward. On impact, a time delay fuse burned for 3 to 5 seconds before a white phosphorus charge ignited, spraying flaming napalm up to about 100 feet in several directions. The delay made it likely the device would land on its side before detonating, maximizing the spread of incendiary material into buildings. Tests at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had shown the M69's destructive ability against replica, Japanese-style houses. It produced many ignition points over wide areas, with napalm that stuck to surfaces and resisted ordinary water-based firefighting. A single B-29 carried 40 cluster bombs, totaling 1,520 individual bomblets. And of the 325 launched that night, 279 bombers reached the target. Operation Meetinghouse would deliver roughly 424,000 incendiary bomblets over Tokyo, producing an extraordinary density of fire-starting devices. American planners expected that concentration to trigger a self-sustaining conflagration in which separate blazes would merge and create powerful winds that drove the inferno well beyond the initial impact zone. The first B-29 lifted from Guam just after 5:30 p.m. on March 9th, piloted by Mission Commander Brigadier General Thomas S. Power of the 314th Bombardment Wing. Over the ensuing hours, bombers departed at 50-second intervals from 3 island bases. The roughly 14-hour round trip pushed crews and machines to their limits. Crews wore lighter flight clothing instead of heavy suits because the lower altitudes were warmer. And without the weight of guns, gunners, and ammunition, the B-29s climbed more efficiently, conserving fuel for the roughly 1,500-mile flight to Japan. As they neared the Japanese coast, pilots used Mount Fuji's snow-capped summit as a visible navigation point. Air raid sirens began around 10:30 p.m. in Tokyo, but many residents stayed in their homes at first. Earlier high-altitude raids had caused limited damage and bred a dangerous complacency. The city's civil defense measures were woefully insufficient. Only 18 concrete shelters existed, able to protect about 90,000 people out of a population of some 4.3 million. Most families relied on shallow trenches covered with boards or on simple dugouts that offered little defense against incendiaries. Tokyo's roughly 8,000 firefighters mostly had hand pumps and bucket brigades intended for peacetime blazes, and neighborhood fire teams were typically made up of the elderly, women, and teenagers armed with sand buckets and water containers. The first Pathfinder B-29s reached Tokyo at 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, approaching from different directions to mark the zone. Flying as low as 5,000 feet, they released M47 napalm bombs that produced immediately visible markers and formed a vast burning X. Minutes later, the main force arrived, aiming for the illuminated mark. Weather proved crucial. Visibility was clear, and surface winds ranged from 17 to 28 miles per hour with gusts to about 45 miles per hour. As M69 clusters dispersed and fell, witnesses described them as small metallic objects flashing in the firelight. A brief, ominous sight that preceded unparalleled urban destruction. Within minutes, thousands of separate fires ignited across the target area. The strong winds spread flames from one structure to the next, and the confluent blazes quickly merged into a single, vast firestorm. Ground temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and damage metal frameworks. Superheated air produced fierce updrafts and vortices that lofted debris high into the sky. Streets became impassable as asphalt burned and timber buildings collapsed under extreme heat. The roar of the fire eclipsed everything else, while smoke and heat cut visibility to only a few feet. 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto was at home in Sumida with her 13-month-old when the attack began. Her husband, an army officer, was stationed elsewhere in the city. She later recounted that the B-29's explosions sounded like a heavy downpour, and that she had never seen an air raid of such intensity. As the inferno spread, she fled with her parents, baby, and sisters through streets clogged with evacuating residents. The narrow alleys of Shitamachi turned deadly as thousands tried to escape at once. Parents were separated from children. The elderly who collapsed could not be helped, and firefighting units abandoned equipment when the heat made it impossible to approach. At the Sumida River, she watched burning fragments fall around them as winds intensified and signboards, doors, and household items were swept into the air. Warehouses lining both sides of the river were consumed by flames. Her father thrust her and the infant into the water, saving their lives, but her mother, father, and sister perished in the inferno. Similar scenes of destruction and death unfolded throughout the burning district. Those entering canals faced dangerously hot water, while many were swept away in the chaos as thousands attempted to reach safety at the same time. The firestorm's winds were strong enough to carry people far from where they had been standing, scattering victims across wide distances. Police stations, hospitals, and official evacuation centers became engulfed by flames. At Kikukawa Elementary School, a designated shelter, investigators later found only scorched metal and human remains, where hundreds had sought refuge. Centuries-old Buddhist temples were destroyed, along with those sheltering inside. The extreme heat and smoke created life-threatening conditions even for those inside supposed safe havens. Superheated air inflicted severe respiratory injuries on anyone exposed, even briefly. Casualty estimates varied. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey reported 87,793 deaths and 40,918 injured. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police recorded 83,793 fatalities and 40,918 wounded, while the Tokyo Fire Department estimated 97,000 killed and 125,000 injured. Historical consensus places total deaths at over 100,000. Surpassing the immediate toll from either atomic bomb, the raid destroyed 267,171 buildings across 15.8 square miles, wiping out roughly a quarter of Tokyo's structures and leaving over 1 million people homeless. Industrial production was heavily affected, as more than half of the city's manufacturing took place in small workshops interspersed in residential areas. The loss of skilled workers and facilities disrupted production of vital war materials. American losses were minimal. 14 B-29s failed to return, with 96 airmen killed or missing. Several aircraft were thrown off course by turbulence from fire-generated updrafts, while others sustained anti-aircraft fire, though Japanese gunners struggled to engage planes flying at unusually low altitudes. Crews later noted that smoke was visible even from their operating altitude. Personnel who had doubted Lame's strategy were struck by the raid's scope and effect. General Lame reflected on the moral weight, acknowledging that, had the war been lost, he might have faced charges as a war criminal. General Arnold sent his congratulations, praising the crew's courage. The operation immediately shaped a strategy, and within 10 days, similar incendiary raids struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, targeting Japan's 4 largest cities. The campaign paused only when the 21st Bomber Command exhausted its supply of incendiary bombs. Production quickly ramped up as American factories prioritized M69 manufacturing. The gulf between American and Japanese capabilities had reached its peak. The U.S. could replace lost B-29s in weeks, while Japan could not rebuild destroyed cities or replace lost workers. American industrial output exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10. And the technical superiority of each American weapon made them far more effective. While the B program's $3 billion cost surpassed Japan's entire military budget for 1945, by mid-1945, the United States produced 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs per month. While Japan struggled to maintain basic ammunition, the methodical approach of American operations reflected a scientific mindset. The Chemical Warfare Service built detailed replicas of Japanese neighborhoods using pre-war architectural plans at Dugway Proving Ground. Standard Oil developed napalm through extensive chemical research, and Harvard and the University of Chicago contributed studies on fire propagation. This combination of research and military application contrasted sharply with Japanese doctrine, which prioritized traditional values over practical material solutions. Proving insufficient against modern warfare, Japan's inability to implement effective countermeasures revealed strategic weaknesses. Despite the preliminary February 25 raid that destroyed 28,000 buildings, authorities made minimal improvements to fire defenses, and proposals to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings were ignored. Evacuation plans remained largely theoretical, and military authorities instructed civilians to stay. But even though intelligence indicated major incendiary attacks were imminent, these failures stemmed from poor inter-service coordination and leadership limitations. Japanese night fighters demonstrated limited effectiveness, highlighting the technological gap. Pilots, such as Lieutenant Sachio Endo, achieved notable individual results, credited with 8 B-29 interceptions. But such successes were rare exceptions. Most night fighter pilots struggled to find targets in darkness, particularly once smoke reduced visibility. Lacking airborne radar, they relied on ground controllers using acoustic detection, a method rendered useless once fires spread. The few pilots who did engage B-29s discovered that their 20mm cannons were generally ineffective against the bomber's sturdy construction unless they struck engines or fuel tanks. Some resorted to ramming attacks, sacrificing themselves to bring down a single aircraft. Tokyo's fire department highlighted Japan's infrastructural weaknesses. The city operated 286 fire engines, mostly manual pump units requiring multiple operators. Water pressure was inadequate for large fires, and damage to pipes and hydrants further hampered efforts. Firefighting procedures focused on saving individual buildings using traditional methods, which proved insufficient against thousands of simultaneous ignition points. Once the firestorm began, most fire companies were quickly overwhelmed, equipment destroyed, and personnel forced to evacuate. The psychological effect on survivors was profound and enduring. Many felt that conventional safety measures had failed. Refugees leaving Tokyo spread accounts of the disaster throughout Japan, contradicting official reports about the war. Factory attendance dropped sharply as civilians lost confidence, and the phrase routine air raid entered common usage as cities were systematically targeted. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had suffered major incendiary attacks, leaving much of urban Japan devastated before the atomic bombings. The success of these operations shaped American planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan. Military strategists calculated that continued incendiary raids could destroy remaining industrial capacity by October. Lane believed that strategic bombing alone might compel Japan to surrender without an invasion. Estimates from the Joint Chiefs of Staff suggested that conventional bombing had already caused roughly 900,000 civilian casualties and would result in millions more if the conflict continued. These evaluations influenced President Truman's decision on the atomic bomb, viewing it not as a substitute for conventional bombing but as a potentially decisive psychological weapon. The human consequences crossed national lines. American aircrews carried the psychological weight of their actions for years, struggling to reconcile their role despite wartime context. Richard Bale of the 9th Bombardment Group recalled seeing the fires clearly from his aircraft, an image that stayed with him. Japanese survivors endured long-lasting physical and emotional trauma. Families on both sides suffered irreplaceable losses affecting multiple generations. The raid left many orphans and widows, straining social support systems and contributing to post-war difficulties. Recovery revealed the scale of destruction. Medical facilities, schools, religious sites, and administrative centers were obliterated. On the morning of March 10th, eastern Tokyo was unrecognizable, with only concrete and brick structures standing across miles of ash-covered ground. Survivors searched desperately for landmarks that no longer existed, while recovery teams required heavy machinery to clear debris. Many victims could not be identified, and mass funerals continued for weeks. Blocked waterways hindered recovery for extended periods. The industrial impact exceeded expectations. Eastern Tokyo contained thousands of small workshops producing specialized components, precision instruments, electrical parts, and mechanical fittings. Their destruction disrupted supply chains for major factories. The loss of experienced craftsmen, machinists, and technical specialists, whose skills took years to acquire, was irreplaceable. Worker output in surviving facilities fell as employees coped with personal loss, housing shortages, and diminished morale. After replenishing incendiary supplies, operations resumed systematically in May using refined techniques that improved efficiency. By July, B-29s were dropping warning leaflets ahead of raids, informing civilians which cities would be targeted. demonstrating psychological dominance and complete air superiority. These missions became routine, often encountering little resistance. Japanese defenses weakened progressively as experienced pilots were lost, ammunition ran low, and civil defense systems collapsed. International legal issues remain a subject of historical debate. The 1907 Hague Convention addressed bombardment of undefended cities, but distinguishing defended areas and military targets proved complex. Post-war tribunals prosecuted some leaders for targeting civilians. Though Allied bombing campaigns were not subject to the same scrutiny, the precedent set by this operation showed that military necessity could be used to justify attacks on civilian areas, influencing later development of international humanitarian law. Even as precision weaponry advanced, weather played a critical role in amplifying the raid's effects, and the March 9 to 10 attack was deliberately timed for predicted strong winds following a dry period. Meteorologists analyzed Japanese weather patterns in detail to determine conditions most favorable for fire spread, and wind speeds that night ranged from 17 to 45 miles per hour depending on location, sometimes exceeding forecasts. This integration of meteorology with operational planning reflected American attention to environmental factors. Individual B-29 crews experienced the mission in ways that differed from planners' expectations. Many were affected by seeing the immense destruction below, and aircrews reported that smoke and atmospheric disturbances were visible even from their flight altitude. Pilots navigated through severe turbulence caused by thermal updrafts, and some later requested different assignments, struggling with moral implications. While others focused on the mission's strategic goal of ending the war quickly, Japan's military response revealed systemic command and control weaknesses. Anti-aircraft units engaged continuously, but had little success in darkness and smoke. Fighter squadrons flew 90 sorties but achieved only scattered interceptions. Fire department leaders received insufficient warning about the scale of the raid, and military authorities prioritized protecting government and military facilities while residential areas burned. Communications failed as infrastructure collapsed and messengers could not traverse affected zones. Post-war memorialization reflects changing historical perspectives. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which gained international attention, Tokyo's firebombing remained less widely known outside Japan. Survivors spent decades advocating for recognition, and Katsumoto Seotoi, himself a survivor, established a center to preserve testimonies and document the impact of the Tokyo raids. Memorializing civilian losses while maintaining historical context created complex narratives. Contemporary military analysts study Operation Meetinghouse to understand the capabilities and limits of air power. The raid demonstrated that urban destruction alone does not guarantee immediate surrender. Japan continued resisting for 5 more months. It illustrated that technical advantages can overcome geographic obstacles, but that distinguishing military from civilian targets becomes extremely difficult in modern warfare. The shift from precision to area bombing reflected escalation in total war. The 21st Bomber Command initially attempted precision strikes following doctrine, but when these proved ineffective, LAME adopted area incendiary attacks that were operationally simpler and far more impactful. By March 1945, urban targeting had become routine, guided by population density and industrial distribution rather than specific military installations. Survivor accounts describe enduring psychological trauma decades later. Children separated from families often never learn the fate of relatives. Yoshiko Hashimoto recalled, "The memory of that night never leaves me. My mother, father, and sister died while my baby and I survived. I think about them every day." The social fabric of working-class Tokyo was permanently altered. Extended families dispersed. Traditional businesses vanished, and neighborhood networks that had existed for generations disappeared overnight. Assessing Operation Meetinghouse involves weighing its role in ending the war. While historians debate whether bombing alone could have forced surrender, the raids clearly hastened Japan's military collapse. Systematic urban destruction made continued resistance increasingly difficult, and Emperor Hirohito later cited the bombing campaigns and domestic conditions as factors in surrender. The roughly 100,000 who perished in Tokyo contributed to ending a conflict that an invasion might have prolonged, potentially causing millions more casualties, a calculation that offers little comfort to survivors, but shapes strategic decisions. Operation Meetinghouse illustrates how warfare evolved from limited military engagements to societal-scale conflict. Residential neighborhoods built over generations were destroyed within hours by weapons manufactured thousands of miles away. A conflict that began with territorial expansion ended with advanced technology devastating civilian populations who had minimal military involvement. The contrast between B-29s carrying sophisticated incendiaries and Japanese civilians equipped with rudimentary firefighting tools demonstrated the decisive role of industrial and technical capability. The historical irony remains that the raid's impact was overshadowed by atomic bombings 5 months later. The immense, immediate casualties of March 10 became less prominent compared to the nuclear attacks, allowing conventional bombing to receive less scrutiny. This perspective enabled continued development of area-effect weapons in later conflicts without the legal restrictions associated with nuclear arms. Statistics provide only a partial understanding. 325 B-29s launched. 279 reached the target. 1,665 tons of incendiaries dropped. 15.8 square miles affected. 267,171 buildings destroyed. 100,000 casualties. Over 1 million displaced. Behind each figure were individuals. American aircrews executing military orders. Japanese families in residential areas. Children separated from parents. Survivors coping with profound losses. Operation Meetinghouse remains history's most destructive air raid, not merely a military achievement but a stark reminder of modern warfare's capacity for devastation. Where strategic goals can justify widespread civilian suffering and entire populations are affected by industrial-scale conflict. Asterisk.